Hello, and welcome to a very special end-of-the-year gala episode of Sidebar from Courthouse News. I am your host, Hillel Aaron, and I am joined today by Nina Pilano in Brooklyn.
Hey, what's up?
Kirk McDaniel in the great state of Texas.
Howdy, y'all.
And Amanda Pamporo in Denver.
Hello.
That's right, we're all together from sea to shining sea. 2022, nearly over. And what a year it was. Decent year, right?
Decent year.
An eventful year.
I remember the ends of 2020 and 2021, everyone was tweeting, oh my God, horrible year, worst year ever. No one's really saying that about this year, right?
Yeah, I noticed that too. We're not doing the put this year in rice and reset it thing. Maybe we've just gotten a little used to the chaos.
No, it was a return to normalcy, right? But not in the courthouse. The courthouse, it was always chaos. On this episode, we'll be reviewing the year's most memorable trials. The ones that made us laugh, the ones that made us cry, and the ones that made us stop and question the decisions we'd made that led us to watching them. I'd like to start the show with a bold assertion, a hot take if you will, that there were two trials of the year this year, and both were defamation trials. Johnny Depp v. Amber Heard and the Alex Jones trial. These were the two trials that not only got tons of media coverage, but sort of swamped our social media feeds, in part because both of them were streamed live. And people could cut up bits of video and post them to Twitter and TikTok. And also because they were both sort of at the intersection of celebrity and politics, and which is kind of the news sweet spot. First, let's start with Alex Jones. Kurt, what was this trial all about?
So this trial, defamation trial, like you said, the lawsuit itself was actually filed against Jones himself and the parent company of InfoWars called Free Speech Systems. So when we talk about this defamation trial, it's two of them. One happened here in Texas that I covered here in Austin. And then the other one was in Connecticut. The event that caused these to happen were statements made by Jones on his show InfoWars about the Sandy Hook massacre, which we're coming up on the 10-year anniversary of that tragedy.
All I know is the official story of Sandy Hook has more holes in it than Swiss cheese. Sandy Hook is a synthetic, completely fake, with actors, in my view, manufactured. Sandy Hook, it's got inside job written all over it.
Parents sued because those statements led to followers of Alex Jones to harassing the parents, calling them, actors, kind of echoing the things that he said on his show and on his platform, and even sending death threats, going to their physical addresses, harassing them. One plaintiff in these cases actually said that a person came to their house and took pictures of the outside of their house and of their family, which is a pretty alarming thing to happen. So this was basically years in the making. In fact, a lot of these lawsuits were filed back in 2018. In the Texas trial, so that's the one that I covered a little bit more, there was a lot of times where Jones, whenever he did take the stand, it seemed like he could not separate himself as a media persona. He could not end that persona. And it often frustrated the judge. It frustrated the plaintiff's lawyers. Sometimes it even frustrated his own lawyers, it seemed like. There was a lot of eye rubbing and deep sighs that you could see. There was also moments whenever actions Jones was actively making in his broadcast were playing a role in the case as it was playing out. A sort of brief explanation of how he got to where he was in this Texas case, and even in the Connecticut case. He had already been found liable for his defamatory languages. These trials were to determine what is the amount that you have to pay in damages because you were found liable. He went on his show and said that this was about, being found guilty. This isn't a criminal proceeding. You couldn't be found guilty. He was already found liable. He was found to be responsible for making these false statements that harmed the families. And so he would often go on his show, say that the judge is requiring him to go before the jury and say, I'm guilty, and I don't have free speech in this courtroom. He called the courtroom a kangaroo court. He even on his broadcast showed a image of the judge on fire.
And did the judge comment on that?
The judge responded with a lot of restraint, I will say, but you could tell that this was a first for her. Judge Maya Gamble was often kind of pushed to her limits with that kind of outside persona and what was being said. So the moment whenever Mark D. Bankston, who was the attorney for the parents here in Austin, in this Austin case, he essentially came out and revealed that Alex Jones's entire cell phone data had been accidentally shared or sent to the plaintiff's team, their legal team.
Oh boy.
By the defendant team.
Yes, Mr. Jones. Indeed. You didn't give this text message to me. You don't know where this came from. Do you know where I got this?
No.
Mr. Jones, did you know that 12 days ago, your attorneys messed up and sent me an entire digital copy of your entire cell phone with every text message you've sent for the past 2 years, and when informed, did not take any steps to identify it as privileged or protect it in any way. And as of 2 days ago, it fell free and clear into my possession. And that is how I know you lied to me.
So this moment, I think, was played. It became a very viral moment. I mean, you could see it all over TikTok and YouTube and news reports, everything. But it was one of those moments, I'll just say for myself that I never expected that. I mean, it was incredibly unique. Might be a highlight of my court covering career, at least for 2022.
Yeah, possibly the biggest mistake a defense attorney has ever made in a trial. And how did it turn out for Alex Jones? What was the verdict?
Well, it did not turn out great. In the Texas case, he was ordered to pay nearly $50 million in damages. And then in Connecticut, Jones was ordered to pay nearly $1 billion, $965 million
Wow.
in damages for his defaming comments made on his show. So we're talking well into $1 billion that he's being ordered to pay. And this is we're recording this here on December 5th. On December 2nd last week, he filed for bankruptcy.
So it's going to be tough ask to get all that money from him.
Yeah. So while the trials may have been decided, it looks like the story of, the money and if these parents are going to see the exact amounts that juries awarded them, that's still going to be an ongoing story going forward.
Well, of course, it was a big year for trials of political extremists, of right-wing extremists. There was sort of a parade of January 6th trials, weren't there? I mean, it was sort of surprising to see all those for me, because I'm used to lawsuits taking 4 years to kind of wind their way to court. These came pretty quickly, didn't they?
Yeah, absolutely. I think some of those were even as recent as last year. I mean, there was a sort of a flurry of activity. I know, obviously, the FBI was tracking these in big databases from the beginning and doing some message board searching and activity to get people to talk about their actions in it. But yeah, I was surprised too about how quickly they've moved.
Kirk, why don't you tell us about some of these January 6th trials?
Yeah, sure. So I'll say basically from all of 2021, even into 2022, I mean, I think we're constantly seeing posts made to our website from our amazing reporter in DC, Emily Zantow. She has been covering a lot of these January 6 trials, but she has also been instrumental in covering, I think, probably the biggest January 6 related trial, and that is the trial of the Oath Keepers.
The FBI describes them as an anti-government militia movement, among them current and former military and law enforcement. Their name is a reference to the oath they took to defend the U.S. Constitution.
Emily covered this Oath Keepers trial for weeks. And a little background on these people. So Stuart Rhodes is the founder and leader of the Oath Keepers. And he, as well as 4 other defendants in this particular case, were charged with seditious conspiracy. Seditious conspiracy is not a very common charge.
Yeah, it sounds like a Civil War thing to me.
This was something that was kind of new for Emily as well. I had asked her, this seems like such a unique sort of trial. What was it like covering it? And she actually told me quite a bit about the ins and outs of sort of the arguments behind both the government, who was trying to get their conviction, and Rhodes and the Oath Keepers, who are obviously trying to stay out of jail.
Seditious conspiracy, it's a very rare charge because of the political aspect to it. When you look back to where the law stems from, it's from the 1860s. In the post-Civil War era, lawmakers were looking for another avenue to be able to prosecute former Confederate soldiers. And so seditious conspiracy can be very hard to prove. The defense really focused on the theory that there was never a plan in advance to breach the Capitol. And so essentially the defense said, hey, if you guys don't have any evidence of these 5 defendants ever actually discussing a plan to breach the Capitol, then that tears a hole in their theory that they came to Washington to try to stop the lawful transfer of power.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I mean, most of the January 6th defendants, and there were quite a few of them, were charged with much smaller things like trespassing and, disturbing the peace, assaulting a police officer. Isn't that right?
That is correct. Yeah. So this is definitely the biggest charge that has been lobbed against these people. And it's important to note, too, so 2 of the defendants in this particular trial, Stuart, Rhodes including, never entered the Capitol. They were not even really near the Capitol during the attack. So, what's kind of the argument behind that, I think, is really interesting.
There's something that strikes me, and it's that the Oath Keepers thought they were protecting America from a civil war, if you take their philosophy at face value, and that you're digging up this Civil War charge in the case. That's just really interesting, the way it loops back around. And you have this narrative of we're patriots protecting the country, but they're not.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing about this case, and Emily and I spoke about this a little bit, but just the fact that it depends on the perspective of the person to see the same thing. And just, I think it's evident of how, different pockets of America, different groups, you could live in a very liberal area, but depending on, where you like to live on the internet, you may be aligned with another group that sees the country in reality as so different. And one really interesting thing was that played out in the courtroom. I had even asked Emily, what were one of those really stunning moments that really stuck with her during the trial?
Defendant Jessica Watkins took the witness stand. None of us reporters were expecting her to do that. And when she took the stand, she admitted to the charge of obstructing police inside the Capitol. And she said she wanted to apologize for doing so. That is something I did not see coming. And then Defendant Thomas Caldwell, his wife, Sharon, testified on his behalf, and she denied that they did anything wrong on January 6th. So she was with him, and she has not been charged with anything. And mind you, Caldwell was the leader of the quick reaction force stationed across the Potomac at a hotel in Virginia, awaiting Rhodes' call to bring the weapons into Washington if necessary. Obviously, that call never came. Caldwell himself took the stand the next day and testified as much. And then, of course, Stuart Rhodes' testimony, one of the highest profile January 6th defendants, took the witness stand in his own defense for 2 days. Rhodes' testimony was really interesting because, like Caldwell, he is not accused of physically breaching the Capitol. But prosecutors in opening arguments likened Rhodes to a general on the battlefield directing his troops. This has been by far one of the most interesting stories I've ever gotten to cover.
Let's take a quick break.
Aspiring to make an impact with data science and AI? We've got you covered. In the Proof of Concept podcast, we explore real-life use cases and discuss the hottest questions in data science and AI. Listen to the Proof of Concept podcast on Dataiku, LinkedIn, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcast.
This is one of my favorite kinds of cases because it takes something that is so contentious depending on what your perspective about the groups that were there that day. It'll shape the way you perceive it. But the court comes down and says, these are the facts that are important, and this is the decision in the end. So it's the tiebreaker on these moments of history and that we watch in the present and what was actually justified, what was not. And Stuart Rhodes was convicted.
That's a great point. It's sort of like sort of trials as sporting events in a way. You can argue all you want about what team is better, but at the end of the day, they play each other, and you figure it out. It is a great crystallization of opinion into an objective moment. I think that's a great point. How did it turn out for Mr. Rhodes?
Well, I asked Emily about that too, and here's what she said.
Stuart Rhodes and Kelly Meggs were convicted of seditious conspiracy, and their 3 other co-defendants were acquitted of seditious conspiracy, but all 5 defendants were found guilty of obstruction of an official proceeding, namely the ceremony that had been underway in Congress on January 6th to certify then President Donald Trump's election defeat. And all 5 of the defendants were also convicted of aiding and abetting, and all but Watkins were found guilty of destroying evidence. So Rhodes and Meggs face up to 60 years in prison for the 3 charges. And the other defendants, meanwhile, at least face up to 20 years each for the obstruction of an official proceeding charge. What's so big about this is that these are the first January 6 defendants to go to trial for seditious conspiracy charges. And the fact that the jury accepted the theory of seditious conspiracy for at least 2 of the defendants has some legal experts saying that the Department of Justice could be increasing its likelihood of future convictions. Because if they were able to convince this jury that 2 of the defendants were involved in a seditious conspiracy, who's to say they won't be able to do it for the upcoming trials of the remaining 4 Oath Keepers defendants and the Proud Boys?
There were also a number of trials stemming from the plot to kidnap Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer. I spoke to Courthouse News' own Andy Monzarud about it.
So the plot in its broadest strokes was basically surround her vacation home, possibly distract law enforcement by blowing out a bridge, and then basically holding a show trial of sorts, or a trial. The plotters would have called it a real trial with a judge, and then depending on the plotter, possibly to hang her, possibly to ransom her. It didn't strike me as terribly well thought out from the get-go. So it did have a bit of a dogs chasing cars kind of vibe to it. Once they got her, I'm not sure if they knew what they were going to do with her.
Ultimately, there were 14 people arrested for the plot, which was foiled by the FBI, I should say. 2 men pled guilty, 2 were acquitted. Adam Fox was portrayed as the sort of so-called mastermind of the plot, was tried along with Barry Croft in federal court. Actually, they were tried twice. The first one ended in a hung jury, and they were both convicted on retrial. Andy covered the other big trial, which was in state court. These were the 3 defendants who belonged to a militia group called the Wolverine Watchmen.
Certainly, there was not a whole lot of dispute of whether these guys harbored deep anti-government beliefs, over whether they were shooting guns and talking a whole lot of shit. But ultimately, they did not accompany Fox toward the governor's place of residence. They never shot anybody. They never shot at anybody. In at least one case, Paul Bellar, he had already left the state by the time all of these arrests came down. He'd said he had left the state. He'd left the militia. He was living with his dad in North Carolina. Now, that was not enough to save him, but it was certainly something, the defense brought up and was a fair point to a certain degree.
So the 3 Wolverine Watchmen were convicted of aiding the plot to kidnap Governor Whitmer. They're currently awaiting sentencing. But one thing that surprised me talking to Andy was how the defendants in this case weren't totally right-wingers.
I think a lot of these guys, while they were definitely toting guns and not big on Democrats, I would say that calling them right-wing is a little bit oversimplified. One of the other things that was getting them really hopped up was the murder of George Floyd. These guys went to Lansing and to Detroit to join protests there. They were perhaps more against the cops than they were on the same side as Black Lives Matter. I would not say that they're fully opposed to all to the left wing. The idea that a new American Civil War was coming was not an exclusive property of the right wing in 2020, not by a long shot. And while these guys, I would say, definitely fit sort of the profile of right-wing extremists, I'd say it is a little bit more complicated than that.
Hey, it's Nina jumping in with a quick update before our next segment. We'll be talking about a trial you may have seen in the headlines in the past few weeks involving the Trump Organization. After we recorded the episode, 2 Trump businesses were convicted of criminal tax fraud and falsifying business records. Sentencing is set for January 13th, and they can be hit with a maximum fine of $1.62 million. That's actually a pretty small number compared with the hundreds of millions that Donald Trump made during his presidency alone, but it is big news, especially with his sights set on the 2024 election. So we wanted to make sure we give you the latest development before we get into all the details. There is a lot more to this case, so keep listening and let's head back in.
We spoke earlier about the intersection of politics and celebrity. Well, who better example of that phenomenon than former President Donald Trump, who didn't go on trial, but his organization did go on trial.
So in some ways, although prosecutors didn't feel this way, it was sort of a run-of-the-mill tax fraud trial. As you mentioned, these 2 businesses, both part of the Trump Organization, are accused of paying employees improperly, doing things like not listing New York City residents as city residents, which got them out of those extra taxes on their forms, and a lot of payments that were sort of off the books. The former CFO, Alan Weisselberg, of the Trump Organization, he was indicted as well as the businesses. He ended up pleading guilty, and he admitted to being paid off the books $1.7 million. So he said that, he told the company's controller to lower his salary and then instead took perks that weren't taxed. So, for example, the Trump Org was paying for his apartment, for a bunch of home furnishings, tuition for his grandkids, a Mercedes-Benz for himself and another for his wife. Yeah, those were the charges the companies were facing.
I can only imagine that Donald Trump has been saying that this is a witch hunt, that this is, a politically motivated prosecution. Did that argument get brought up at trial, or was it just a boring tax fraud trial?
Right. Good question. It did in a way. So Alan Weisselberg, the CFO, testified as part of his plea deal, and he was a real insider as far as the Trump family. He actually started working for Fred Trump back in 1973, and then started working for Donald Trump. So about 5 decades working with the family, and definitely mentioned some of those views and talked about several Trump Organization employees testified and talked about feeling themselves sort of like they were under pressure and they were under political pressure from prosecutors when they met during their grand jury testimony, felt that they didn't have the right representation and that they were very uncomfortable. And so that came up a few times. And I think watching Weisselberg testify was really interesting. He is, on the one hand, he pleaded guilty to these charges that implicate the organization, but he's very loyal to the Trump still. He's still in their good graces. He is actually still on the company payroll. He's on unpaid leave, but he's still getting $1.4 million a year. So things are going okay. It's interesting, actually, the day that Weisselberg finalized his guilty plea right around his birthday, he celebrated his birthday that night at Trump Tower with a bunch of employees. So yeah, it's safe to say that relationship is still strong. And he talked about, being embarrassed and ashamed of what he did, really kind of, in a sense, taking one for the team. Doesn't want to make things worse for the Trumps. But then, of course, at the same time, he has to keep up his end of the plea bargain, or he's facing more jail time if he walks that back. So, he spoke, for instance, about defense attorneys argued that Weisselberg was the only one benefiting from the scheme. This was all him, nothing to do with, nobody else knew. But Weisselberg had to admit on the stand that he knew the company was going to benefit when he swapped out his salary for these benefits. They would save on payroll taxes, and that was something he at least considered. So he's sort of in this precarious position where he's kind of threading the needle there. And yeah, as you said, Trump himself wasn't named, but his name definitely came up a lot at trial. We talked about the cleanup that happened at the company following the 2017 election. So Weisselberg sort of, again, testified Trump didn't know before then. And certainly by the time the cleanup happened, Donald Trump's children, who had formerly taken over the company by then they knew what was going on and about this fraud, but it wasn't clear if Donald Trump knew because he was in the White House. So there was this sort of back and forth. And as you can imagine, a lot of responses that he just didn't remember what was going on.
I was curious because if there's one thing that maybe anyone knows about Donald Trump is that he loves loyalty. And I think initially when reports were out that Weisselberg was going to plead guilty, it seemed like there was like a crack in that like loyalty. There was a crack in this like league of those who are really close to Trump. What do you think went behind the, pleading guilty?
Yeah, I think it was a little bit of a surprise in some ways when the indictment came down, which was last summer, 2021. There definitely was this sense of, I think a lot of legal experts and political analysts were thinking this might be an opportunity for someone from the Trump org to flip, that they thought, and he did ultimately cooperate, but I'm not sure his testimony amounted to this sort of, big reveal of what was going on. It was much more nuanced. Like I said, pretty much a tax fraud trial. There was plenty of testimony that was just about how W-2s work, how 1099s work, and just what exactly was in the contract with the Trump org and their tax preparers. So it was much more, I think, in the weeds than this sort of major moment where a witness flipped and exposed the Trump organization. And there was some time, in between the indictment and the trial. So hard to know behind closed doors what was going on and what was being discussed between Weisselberg and the Trump organization.
Well, there was another Republican politician who was in court this year. Sarah Palin sued a little newspaper called the New York Times.
Yeah, who are they?
They have this great game called Wordle.
What's that?
Check it out. How'd that work out for Sarah Palin?
In the end, not too well. But this was a defamation lawsuit that goes back to 2017 concerning an editorial in the New York Times that really centered on violence and political discourse and rhetoric that can lead to things like shooting. And this was in the wake of, if you can think back to then, shooting at a congressional baseball practice for a charity event in Alexandria, Virginia. After that happened, this editorial came out and it mentioned among this sort of potentially violent rhetoric that Sarah Palin's political action committee had put out a map showing crosshairs placed over certain Democratic districts that they were sort of targeting politically. And the point was being made that, this can fuel violence.
Today, getting to the heart of her claim that the Times damaged her reputation by linking her campaign rhetoric to a mass shooting in a 2017 editorial, saying on the stand she felt, quote, powerless against the paper.
It was an opinion piece, right? The New York Times wrote?
It was an editorial. So, we heard from the editorial page editor at the time, who was
James Bennett, right?
That's James Bennett, yeah. And he was heading up the team, but at the same time, there were, multiple hands on it, multiple eyes on this piece. So we heard a lot of testimony from journalists at the Times about just their editorial process, and saw earlier drafts that maybe didn't have the same or wouldn't have carried the same potential liability, and how the piece was rewritten. So that was kind of, if you're a journalist watching the trial, I got to nerd out a little bit about seeing that process.
What did the editorial say? It said that she was encouraging political violence. Is that what it was?
Essentially, yeah. And one of the things that came up was it referred to her PAC, right? It didn't necessarily refer to Palin. It had her name in there, but that was something that was argued too on behalf of the Times, that they were making this sort of statement about the entities and the organizations that are perpetuating this, and not necessarily an individual person, was one of the things that they had to say.
Let's take a quick break.
With more guns than people in this country, the conversations around guns and their place in American society are more relevant and important than ever. That's why we've created Talking About Guns, a podcast that normalizes dialogue around a typically polarizing topic. We invite guests from all sides of the gun debate, from firearms instructors and veterans to journalists, activists, and lawmakers, but most importantly, gun owners. We talk about the hot-button issues, but without all the screaming. Catch up on seasons 1 and 2 now by subscribing on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube, and stay tuned for more exciting guests as we continue to change the conversation around gun safety. Talking About Guns is presented by 97%.
So you got a crash course in taxes and journalism.
We learn
in
a
the
lot
same
with
year.
this
You're
job,
so
huh?
lucky.
It's very hard to sue a newspaper for defamation. Did people think that this was going to work out well for her?
I don't think so. I think, case was tossed out once, reinstated by the circuit court, and in fact, it was thrown out a second time. And what happened there was, this was Judge Rakoff in the Southern District of New York. He decided to dismiss the case while the jury was deliberating. And added a little drama because some jurors, obviously was reported on right away, especially by the New York Times. So some jurors got a push notification on their phone, got an alert saying the case had been dismissed. They're obviously not supposed to look anything up about the case, but it just appeared on their lock screen. So that became something, Sarah Palin's appealed the verdict. It was tossed out. The jury also found the Times not liable. So sort of a double whammy there. And in the appeal, I'm sure that will come up. Judge Rakoff mentioned during one of the trial proceedings, I admit I didn't know what a push notification was until this moment. So
judges, huh?
Modernizing the courts and new technology.
If only we had an episode from this past year that touched on that exact topic.
That's right. You can go back to our juries episode and learn all about the fun stuff that happens during the selection and jury process.
That's a first. Shameless plug.
Another thing that was interesting about the trial was just sort of the circus around it. Obviously, Palin's a very well-known figure, and a ton of reporters there. Sarah Palin, I think, just remained really friendly. She kind of, both when she was on the stand testifying, her sort of, you betcha, one of her favorite expressions, back when she was running as vice president. But yeah, so, at one moment I sort of chatted with her. She was waiting for her Uber inside because it was raining, and she said she was enjoying the city minus the weather. She got COVID at the beginning of the trial, which was another little bit of drama because she was then seen at restaurants around the city. But yeah, and that delayed the trial a little bit. But yeah, very cordial. She was wearing this bubblegum pink blazer, and we talked about her blazer. She said she got it at a thrift store in Phoenix while she was visiting her daughter. So just remained really friendly, I think, with everybody, and ultimately didn't turn out her way. It happened to also overlap her trial with the criminal trial against Michael Avenatti. He was Stormy Daniels' lawyer in her lawsuit against Donald Trump. And in his case, that was a criminal case. He was convicted of wire fraud and identity theft for taking $300,000 from a publishing advance paid to Stormy. But having, the Avenatti and Palin trials happening at the same time, things happened like these two ran into each other in the cafeteria upstairs and sort of, with reporters around kind of just being nosy and watching the conversation. They, again, remained friendly with each other. Palin wished him good luck. And I talked to her about the verdict. She hadn't heard it yet when we spoke, but, sort of was curious about his reaction to that. So just the sort of, fun courthouse moments, I think, where everything kind of ramps up all at once.
It was a big year for celebrity defamation trials. We did a whole episode about the Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial back in April that you can go back and listen to. This trial, I think you could sort of file it broadly under a Metoo trial. The sort of going back and litigating behavior of men toward women. And there were quite a few celebrity Me Too trials, many of them involving celebrities accused of sexual assault from decades ago. And it didn't always go so well for the plaintiffs or the prosecution. There was the Kevin Spacey trial.
In this case, the actor Anthony Rapp, he sued Kevin Spacey saying that back in 1986, Kevin Spacey had sexually assaulted him. At that time, Anthony Rapp was 14 years old. And he was able to file this decades-old lawsuit under a new New York law called the Child Victims Act that is the window has since passed, but it gave people a 1-year window to file old claims that were beyond the statute of limitations. Again, the jury ultimately found Kevin Spacey not liable.
This morning, actor Kevin Spacey found not liable in a sexual battery case dating back to the 1980s.
Mr. Spacey is deeply grateful for the jury system and for this jury in particular.
I think watching the trial, it was really an uphill battle from the start because Anthony Rapp would have had to prove that any kind of trauma response or mental health issues that he's having now were all the result of this alleged attack that happened so many years ago. I think also what was similar to Amber and Johnny is just a lot of really personal details were aired out in court, including things like other abuse and events that happened in Anthony Rapp's life. And that had to be, I think, part of Kevin Spacey's defense to point to other incidents that could be causing what he's feeling today. But, you have to, I think about that if you sit through this trial and all of your kind of personal information about your family and relationships, all gets put out there. And then at the end of it, this is the outcome. I can only imagine how that must feel for the plaintiff in this case.
Well, here in Los Angeles, on the 10th floor of the criminal courthouse, just last month, we had not one but two celebrity sexual assault trials. One side of the hall, you had Danny Masterson, star of That 70s Show and noted Scientologist. And on the other end of the hallway, you had none other than the godfather of Me Too, Harvey Weinstein, sort of patient zero of Me Too. And it's very, very odd to see him. I mean, he's already been convicted of rape in New York. So he's sentenced to 23 years in prison. He's 70, so that his health is already failing. So it's basically a life sentence. And they're sort of wheeling him into Southern California now to do our version of the Harvey Weinstein trial. But at any rate, this case has been going on for a few weeks. It actually just wrapped up. The jury, I think, has the case now. But I'm interested to see how the jury, sort of views this idea of flogging a convicted felon with another couple of decades of prison. Meanwhile, as the Weinstein trial was going on, you had Danny Masterson. He was alleged to have raped 3 different women some 20 years ago. The main subject of interest was whether or not this trial was about Scientology. This was a sort of a main thing that all the women were saying was, Danny Masterson did this to me, and I was told not to speak up about it by the Church of Scientology. And he was able to sort of have his position of power because not only he was a famous actor, but because he was a sort of famous Scientologist. And then the judge sort of kept trying to say, well, this trial isn't about Scientology. Don't ask so many questions about Scientology. So there's a lot of sort of back and forth about that. And ultimately, with this one, the jury deadlocked. In fact, they came back. It was the week before Thanksgiving. They came back after only a few days. They say, we're deadlocked. We can't reach a decision. The judge said, well, come on. You've been at this for 2 days. You got to come back. So the judge ordered them all to come back after Thanksgiving. So they took a week off. They come back after Thanksgiving. Meanwhile, two jurors have COVID and another one has something else. So they need to put in the alternates and actually they're supposed to then re-deliberate, start over their deliberations. And again, 2 days later, they're deadlocked and they're like, we can't possibly agree. And the judge says, all right, declares a mistrial. And so, yeah, that's a hung jury. They're probably going to retry him, but maybe not. So you're sort of seeing some of the limits of the Me Too movement. Do I have that right?
Yeah, I think so. These mixed verdicts, and I think in general, you guys know I'm fascinated by juries. They're my favorite part of the legal system, and you have to wonder, going home for a week, what does that do? Maybe incidentally, you see things on the news, or maybe you just take a beat and you think about things more than you would, or in a different way than if it were just an overnight break. I wonder kind of what their discussions were like.
You fill up on turkey and you get back and you're just like,
that's right.
Maybe he is guilty.
The other thing I wonder about the January 6th trials kind of coming up more quickly than usual. The ones we're talking about now were delayed by at least a few years. Me Too, the sort of breakout Harvey Weinstein, as you say, patient zero stories were 2017. So there has been a little bit of a delay since articles came out and allegations were made. So thinking about that timeline too, how does public opinion shift? How might people think about this differently?
I think the public that is insulated from the issues and feels less directly impacted, it's easy for them to move on. But as Nina said earlier, there was the law in New York that allowed people to bring into court childhood wrongs. 9,000 people in a year filed that lawsuit. So if that happened to you, you're never going to outlive it. The Sandy Hook parents, they are going to live with that forever. So these issues, when they fall out of the public eye, go down to page 8 in the newspaper, people are still living them.
Of course, not every celebrity got off scot-free this year. There was R. Kelly. He did not have a great legal year. Is that right?
Yeah, he's sort of, at this point, it seems like he has these perennial court proceedings that are just going up between criminal and civil. It's just going to be continue to be a long road for him. But this year he sat for a federal trial in Chicago. It was started around late August through mid-September. And in some ways, this was a callback to the first trial that R. Kelly faced, which had to do with child pornography. Charges came out in the early 2000s, and then he sat trial in 2008. And that trial centered on a tape that allegedly showed R. Kelly having sex with an underage girl. That tape came back in this trial. Kelly was charged with 13 counts of possession and distribution of child porn, as well as some conspiracy counts.
Yeah, he was acquitted of a trial, 10 years ago or something. And now 10 years later, he's being convicted in multiple trials. That's kind of surprising.
Yeah, I should say back in 2008, that trial, he was acquitted. And really the reason why was because the girl who was alleged to be in the tape, who I guess was also R. Kelly's goddaughter, said that it wasn't her. And her family said it wasn't her in the tape. And without that testimony, without that kind of major aspect for the prosecution, he got off. So that was an acquittal. So I talked to our colleague, Dave Burns, who covered the trial. Here's what he had to say about the defense and kind of how the trial went down.
So of those 13 charges, he was acquitted on all the conspiracy charges. What they nailed him on was the child porn charges for having the tapes, and then also for the sexual enticement of minors for having sex with 3 underage girls between the late 90s and early 2000s. The connection between the 2008 trial, which was mostly about that tape with his goddaughter, and this current trial is honestly kind of muddy, because it was never really clear in trial just how many tapes there were and what tapes they were talking about, right? Because there were numerous girls that came forward, or now women, who came forward saying that they made threesome tapes with Kelly. And so the jury got to see some scenes of one of the sex tapes in the trial. But, something the defense, always brought up is that no one is exactly sure how many tapes there are, how many are out there, what's fake, what's real, how many are just tapes with him and his of-age wife, how many are with his goddaughter, how many are with other girls. That was never really made clear, I think, in the trial. And I think it contributed to why he was able to get off on the conspiracy charges.
R. Kelly continues to have a ton of support. If you've written any story about him, you know that his supporters are very quick to jump on the thread and comment about, there's a lot of hashtag free R. Kelly and just continuing to claim his innocence in the whole thing. I saw that definitely in Brooklyn. There were some people who traveled in and went to trial, but Dave was there in R. Kelly's hometown. So I think he got a really good dose of the double-edged sword of when somebody who's represented your community for so long is charged in something like this.
There's tension because on the one hand, you get people in Chicago who see Kelly as a stain on the city's legacy. They want to see some amount of justice for, all these women that he sexually abused. On the other hand, you can't really ignore the racial aspect of this. The U.S. justice system has a very, very long history of, stringing up black men on bogus charges, mostly to fuel the prison labor industry. I still get messages from fans who think that this is a setup and, eventually, some way, his name's going to be cleared and this will all come out as a racist conspiracy. Whether that happens, I'm skeptical.
So that's certainly an argument that his attorneys, his supporters make and will continue to make. He's facing other charges. He's appealing both convictions already. So like I said, it'll continue to be a long road for R. Kelly, who is already serving 30 years in prison for the Brooklyn conviction. He's yet to be sentenced in Chicago.
So bad year for R. Kelly in the courts. Good year for Cardi B in the courts. She had two civil trials, and she won both of them, 2 for 2. She wins a defamation suit against a celebrity blogger in January, I believe in Atlanta, I want to say. Awarded $4 million for that. I covered a trial involving her a few months ago. I cover some trials. Sounds like I do not cover as many trials as Nina, but I do cover some trials, and I find most of them boring. Even the ones involving celebrities. This one was easily the most entertaining trial I've ever covered. It was 3.5 days, just real, all killer, no filler. The suit concerned Cardi B's debut mixtape entitled "Gangsta Bitch Music Volume 1." You guys heard this one?
Not familiar.
No, but it sounds great.
I'll have to check it out.
Yeah. And me, you, and the jurors have never heard this. The jurors, by the way, almost all white, almost all over the age of 50. I believe all of them said that they had never listened to hip hop. So I was really curious, how exactly are they going to view this? So anyways, Gangsta Bitch Music Volume 1, a phrase that was spoken many, many times during trial. And it was really fun just to listen to all these old white lawyers not only say the album cover, but at some point they were talking about the songs, and it was just great. Anyways, the album cover featured Cardi B in the back of a car with a man's head between her legs, appearing to be pleasuring her orally. And the man's back, you could only see his back, had this large tattoo of a tiger on it. Sort of, in my mind, an ordinary looking tattoo. However, it turns out that the model in the photo shoot had a different back tattoo, and that was deemed not tough enough. And also, as Cardi B would later testify, he had back knee, which she didn't like. At any rate, so the graphic designer does a Google search of back tattoos and comes up with this big tiger tattoo and photoshops it on, and job done, album released. However, the owner of the back tattoo is a man named Kevin Michael Brophy, a resident of Orange County, a sort of bald, muscular surfing type, works for a surfing apparel company. And you ask him about his tattoo, and this tattoo is his identity, so he says. He claims that when he walks around shirtless, as he surely does often in Orange County, that he is recognizable if his back is turned by, oh, that's that tiger tattoo. That must be Michael, or he goes by Mike, but Mr. Brophy. And anyways, his back tattoo, or we call it, I learned a lot about tattoo lingo during this trial. It's called a back piece. So his back piece is this large tiger kind of fighting off a snake, and there's some flowers, and there's like a woman kind of on the side, and it's just, in my mind, this is like sort of a mishmash of tattoo cliche, but for him, this is, it was made by a very special, very famous tattoo artist, and it was done over the course of a year, and it was all these different sittings, and I guess it cost a lot of money too, and it was featured in a book about tattoos, and so for him, this tattoo is like not only his pride and joy, but like his identity. So he sues Cardi B, saying that she stole the back tattoo from him for this album cover. He sues her not for copyright because he doesn't own the copyright, but he sues her for invasion of privacy and a misappropriation of Brophy's likeness because this is his identity again. So, I mean, he's a very serious guy. He clearly takes himself very seriously, and he goes to testify at trial. I mean, this trial, one of the things that made it entertaining was it really was just about the testimony of Brophy and Cardi B. I mean, there was a few other people, but it was really just them. And so Brophy gets up and he's totally humorless, and he says, "This was my Michelangelo." He says, people would instantly recognize him from seeing this tattoo. And he called the use of it on the album cover a digital molestation with a straight face. And so, Cardi B takes the stand basically the next day. And again, the jury, mostly white, not hip hop listeners. I'm really curious kind of how they're going to take her. And she is just pissed off. She is incandescent. She cannot believe she has to spend 4 days in Orange County listening to this guy talking about his back tattoo as if it was a Michelangelo. And she says, she has a thick New York accent. And she says, it's insulting to me as a woman that the man is claiming responsibility for my fame from a portion of his tattoo. I mean, she is just indignant. And you could just tell, this is one of the things I find interesting about celebrities, but most of them, they just have this magnetism about them where they can hold the room in the palm of their hand, where you can sort of hear people almost like not trying to breathe so loud so they can kind of absorb them more. And her testimony was like this. And, she was just so angry, but it was electric. So she's so angry. The lawyer says like, oh, have you gotten so famous that you can't realize that this man has suffered? Like, this man isn't worthy of sympathy, basically. And Cardi B says, yeah, but he hasn't suffered. He hasn't gotten fired. He hasn't gotten divorced. How has he suffered? Please tell me how has he suffered. She's like screaming. And it was just kind of like this lawyer was totally cowed by her. And she was also really, really funny. I mean, this is sort of the amazing thing. This woman's not a comedian. She's a hip hop artist, but apparently her lyrics are quite funny. And she was really funny. They keep playing these clips of her video deposition. And I think the plaintiff's attorney was playing them to see like, oh, look how disrespectful this woman is. But in fact, she comes off as hilarious. She's explaining how she didn't get the summons because she doesn't check her mail. And she's like, oh, I don't really check my mail. And the lawyer says, and after that, did you say that mail is for old people? And there was like a sort of a pause again, because the jury is like, pretty old themselves. And she just takes a pause and she goes, yeah, I said it. And everyone just laughs. I mean, the judge, the jury, everyone laughs. And she's just like, she says, she was like, sorry, but it's true. And it was great. Again, popularity contest wise, we sort of figured she would win. And also, I mean, the case just seemed pretty flimsy. The idea that this was really like a misappropriation of someone's likeness. Actually, there was this other really funny part where, again, Brophy is saying how unique this tattoo is. This tattoo could be only be mine, the tiger. And he's like, looking this way. And they had the Cardi B's attorney only had one witness besides her, which was some sort of tattoo expert. And he gets up and he explains like, well, yeah, actually tiger tattoos are really common. And there's really only one way to show a tiger, because like if you show him overhead, he kind of just looks like this. And you really just have to show him like kind of to the side with his head turned. And it's like the only way to do it. So anyways, it was pretty funny. The jury deliberated for about an hour and a half. Cardi B won.
It strikes me too. Cardi B's obviously known for a lot of things, but she herself has a really iconic tattoo. I mean, she's got a whole bunch, but on her kind of outer thigh, this peacock tattoo that she's sort of known for. It's really recognizable. And it's funny that this ended up being about somebody else's recognizable tattoo when she has this like really iconic ink that is kind of, to her fans. She's posted getting it retouched, gotten a lot of support for that kind of thing.
Yeah, there was a really nice moment after the trial ended where Brophy, perfect posture, goes up to Cardi B and kind of puts his hand out to shake it. And it's just like, no hard feelings. I was just, doing what I thought I had to do. And it was sort of like an honorable moment between the two adversaries. And it was great because as a reporter, you could just sort of watch it all unfold like a play because they were like 3 feet in front of you.
How'd she respond to that?
I think she was fine with it. I mean, afterwards she was like, I think she was really pissed at him for having to be there. But then once it was all over, she was like, well.
So it sounds like you kind of had your own, like, I don't know, like legal drama. Like that just sounds like something right out of a TV show. You have this like very vocal, very flamboyant, hip hop artist and like this kind of insane reason of being there. Like that just, lucky you got to cover that.
Yeah, it was fun. And all I had to do was drive to Orange County for 4 days in a row. For our last segment, we thought we would talk about the trials we're looking forward to in 2023. Who wants to start?
Well, I can start off because mine will definitely not just be of one trial, but other than working here on the podcast, I also cover Texas legislature. And just as any other legislature in any other state, it's going to be a very eventful one full of lawsuits, depending on what the lawmakers decide to do. I always learn a lot, whether it be about ag law or tax law or energy law, energy capital of the U.S. Here in Texas. So I'm always excited for whatever lawsuits get filed because I'm certain to learn something new. And yeah, it'll definitely add for some more excitement in my life.
Possibly the biggest one coming up in Brooklyn federal court is the trial of Genaro Garcia Luna. He was the head of Mexico's federal police force, the top security official in the country, and he's accused of taking millions of dollars in bribes from the Sinaloa cartel, which was run by El Chapo. You may know Joaquin Guzman. And he was convicted for his role in running the cartel in Brooklyn at the beginning of 2019, and testimony back at that trial from a cooperating witness involved Garcia Luna, and the witness talked about these bribes, talked about it during testimony about El Chapo and all of the kind of lavish expenses and having a personal zoo and just all of the wild stuff going on over at his place. So this is sort of, tangential to all that, but I imagine we'll get a lot of testimony about the cartel, about its activities. So I think this will be a pretty big one in Brooklyn. One other big trial coming up in Brooklyn. 2 men are standing trial for the murder of Jason Mizell, who you probably know by his stage name, Jam Master Jay. He was the DJ over on DMC, and he was killed in 2002. So this goes back 20 years, and it was a cold case for a long time. 2 men were indicted just a few years ago in 2020, and I imagine this will be another big case. We'll probably get a lot of entertainment reporters around, and I think it's just fascinating. Obviously, Jam Master Jay's family is looking for justice decades later, and I think it'll be a pretty big one.
Amanda, you looking forward to anything this year?
Oh yeah. The Dominion defamation lawsuits are going to start coming down the pipeline. Dominion has about 25 pending cases, and one of their employees has 6 lawsuits in Colorado courts.
And sorry, remind us what Dominion is.
Yeah. So in 2020, election experts tell us we had the safest election in U.S. history. And yet we had the most conspiracy theories and controversy around the results of the election. We have groups of individuals who thought it was stolen in the days after the election. We saw rumors from the individual level go up to the news media and become repeated by Donald Trump's campaign and his attorneys, Sidney Powell and Rudy Giuliani. So I love these cases. I find these cases so interesting because you're seeing the anatomy of a lie go viral and become repeated until people start to believe it. And to watch it be picked apart in court is important because it's one of those polarizing ideas that people have latched onto. And I'm just really excited to see a jury weigh in on.
Well, yeah, that does sound like a good trial. The trials that I'm looking forward to, not one trial, but a number of trials. Los Angeles City Hall is on trial. Maybe not literally, but there are a lot of City Hall trials coming up next year. There is the trial of sitting city councilman Mark Ridley Thomas, who's in trial in federal court for bribery. Former city councilman Jose Huizar, also on trial for bribery. And Mayor Eric Garcetti, who has about a week left. By the time this podcast airs, he'll be out of office. But he's finally hoping to be confirmed as ambassador to India, which has been kind of pending for more than a year. He's not going on trial, but he may have to testify in a civil trial that pits his former bodyguard, LAPD officer Matthew Garza, against Garcetti's former political aide, Rick Jacobs, for sexual harassment. Garza has accused Jacobs of sexual harassment, and it's that charge actually that's responsible for holding up Garcetti's nomination as India ambassador, and the witness list is just sort of a veritable who's who of the Garcetti administration of the last few years. There's a lot of sort of questions about who's lying that have been kind of litigated in the LA local politics media. So hopefully, I hope it goes to trial. It may end up settling now that Garcetti is soon to be out of office and sort of the pressure has been turned down a bit. So I think that just about wraps it up for 2022. Thank you all for joining me for this gala episode, and I'll see you all next year.
Thanks, Lil. Happy New Year.
All right. Talk to you later.
Bye. Happy New Year.
All right. Cool. Thank you, guys. Well, that just about wraps things up for Sidebar, and indeed for 2022. Thanks to Kirk, Nina, and Amanda, and most especially you, the listener. If you liked what you heard, do check out our website, www.courthousenews.com, for all your legal news requirements. And of course, we will be back with exciting courthouse coverage in 2023. Until then, Happy New Year and goodbye.